My name is Roger Berkowitz, and as you know, I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I welcome you to our virtual reading group. We are today going to finish up volume one of The Life of the Mind on Thinking. In many ways, we finished it last week insofar as we read the last two sections of the actual thinking chapter or first book of this book. Today we're reading what's called the Postscriptum, which is really a look forward to the next two books that Hannah Arendt was going to write on willing and judging. She never finished them. She never finished any of these three books, but certainly never finished those. The willing section is drafted, and the judging section was never written. And so this postscriptum has become somewhat of one of those famous prophetic texts in which people scour very few words to try and say what would have been in this section, especially the judging section. And, the idea that Hannah Arendt was in some sense going to solve her life's work by writing a section on judging, which was going to give the answers to all of the dilemmas that her work explored over the previous 40 years, is one of those ideas, hopes that I think especially many young Arendt scholars hold. I get emails from people all the time saying, I figured out Arendt on Judgment, and as a result, I know everything that she was going to say. So we're going to read this postscriptum today. It's only 4 pages. It's not a lot, and yet there's a lot in it that we can try and say something about. And then we'll talk a little bit about going forward and our next book today. So I will start and try and put this postscriptum in context. I hope that leads to questions and really a conversation. So, as I said, the postscriptum comes at the end of the section on thinking and is a bridge to the following sections that we're told will be on willing and judging. Looked at from the perspective of time speculations, she says, they concern matters that are absent, either because they are not yet or because they are no more. And this is in contradiction to thinking, which deals with the invisibles in all experience and always tends to generalize, whereas thinking, willing, and judging deal with particulars. So let me just break this up into some, I hope, manageable bites. On the one hand, we can separate willing and judging from thinking, because willing and judging concern, temporally speaking, what is not yet, namely willing, what will come, what I want to be, and judging, which concerns what is no more, namely what already has happened, and in which I make a judgment about it. Thinking, as we know, is very different from judging and willing along these time speculations. We talked about this last week, but let me just quickly review. In the parable that Kafka tells about the eternal past and the eternal eternal future pushing in on the past, thinking is that activity, that faculty and activity in which we, on the one hand, in the dream of metaphysics, we jump out of this battleground between the past and the future, and we become a disinterested spectator who can find meaning and judge the performance of the past and the future. That's sort of Arendt's reading of Kafka's parable. And she says in the last chapter that we can actually go further without doing violence to the parable, and say that it's actually the fact that man gives meaning to the world by deflecting the stream of the past and the future. That thinking is precisely this act of deflection. That to me is, if you could, the first time I think I sort of understood that or made sense of that, it was a huge revelation to me. What does that mean to say that thinking is an act of deflection and fighting? It means that in thinking, you take the past, you take the possible futures, and you wrestle them, you fight them, and you come up with an account of the world as it is. And in so doing, you act freely. And she says, thinking is thus the place of freedom. It's the place in which we are in this gap, in this temporal gap between past and future, and we remove ourselves from both past and future, and we find a meaning. We make a meaning, and that's why it's an activity of freedom. It's not true. Remember, the whole premise of thinking is that it doesn't seek truth, it seeks meaning. And if we understand that this idea of thinking is this battle, this deflection that takes the past and the future and, in a sense, wrestles them into a present that is meaningful, every person and every generation, Arendt writes, paves anew the path of thought. Every person in the now and every generation in the now steps out of time, steps out of the battle of the past and the future into a non-time, she calls it, a non-time of the present that is out of order and original and new. And then she starts talking about great works, great artworks, great books, great acts, great political acts. And what she says is that great works, see the past, people who create the great works, so the great artists, politicians, actors, individuals, generations, peoples, those who create great works, she says, see the past as their past, as their predecessors. I see the past as mine. It comes to me. I see the past as leading up to me, thus relative to me. We talked a lot about the relativity of this thinking act for her. And I also see the future as my successors or our successors. And thus I see the present as my time. And in that present, I create works, artworks, acts, political works, depends on what kind of creator I am, that stamp a kind of temporal nowness, my temporal nowness, my idea, onto this now, and I put them into the world, and people can, as we've talked about, ignore them, at which point my thought, the manifestations or reifications of my thought are forgotten, or they can destroy them or put me in jail because my thought is considered to be dangerous and rebellious, or they can be struck by my thought, the things I reify, the artworks I make, the actions I do, and people can start talking about them. And in talking about them, they can start to immortalize them. And my things, and maybe me as a thinker or actor, become part of the immortal world that lasts. In this fight, this wrestling, this battle of thought, she says thought is like an island of pure reason, separated from the everyday world by a wide and stormy sea. It's not the island of truth. As we said, it's the island of meaning, where I make my meaning in the world. So that's one way that willing and judging differ from thinking. Thinking is about the now, creating the now, being in the now, fighting in the now. Willing and judging are about past and the future. A second way, she says, that willing and judging differ from thinking is that thinking deals with generalities, right? Invisibles. It desenses. We've talked about this a lot. It doesn't deal with particulars. It takes everything away from the world. It annihilates the real. It destroys all criteria for judgment and measurement. Whereas willing and judging deal with particulars. And thus they're much closer to the world of appearances, not the world of invisibles and thought. So that's sort of the first. She says, okay, there's this distinction. We've been talking about thinking. Now we're going to move to willing and judging. And A, we're no longer going to be dealing with the present. We're going to be dealing with the past and the future. And B, we're going to move into this world of particulars as opposed to generalities. She says, one might seek to use this insight to justify thinking, to make thinking something that we should do. In the sense that thinking becomes an indispensable preparation for willing into the future, right? If you want to know what you will, you should know what you think, what's true, what's rational. And if you want to judge the past, you should know what's right. And she says, no, actually, this is not how you justify thinking. Thinking is no use. Right? We've talked about the one time thinking has use for her is in times of emergency, moral or other emergency, where the thinker's very uselessness, their standing apart, separates them and shows the need to stop and think and question what is happening. She says, willing cannot be prepared for by thinking because willing is radically free. If you believe that we prepare our will by first thinking about what is true or what is right or what is rational, then you seek to limit will. In a sense, you limit will by rationality. And that, she says, is to deny the very radical power of will, which is to be spontaneous and free. And so she says that Henri Bergson says that a will is a coup d'etat. It's absolutely free. It can't be controlled by something like thinking or reasoning. He then goes through a short history of what the long chapter on willing is going to be. He starts with St. Paul, who famously says, and what she says is that willing has a history, and it emerges at a historical time. The Greeks didn't know willing. The first real thinker of the will is St. Paul, who says, I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. This is from the letter to the Romans. The idea here is that what I want to do is follow the law, do the good, according to Paul. But I don't do the good most of the time. I usually do the bad which I hate insofar as I'm a good person. And in every will, for Paul, and then more so for Augustine, if ever I say I should will to do the good, I should will to tell the truth. Why? Because it's the law, because it's the right thing to do. Immediately, Augustine says, what pops into my head is I should lie. Because, well, I don't really want to follow the law. I also want to do what the opposite. The very idea that I'm constrained to tell the truth raises a counter will, what Augustine calls a nil, a nilling to say I should lie. So that in every will, there is a I will and there is a I nil. There's a battle. And so the will itself is this battle. And it's only resolved in Augustine through the idea of love, namely that in acting into the world, I resolve my battle between I want to lie and I want to tell the truth, and whichever one I do, I love my act, and in doing so, I resolve the conflict that was in my will. So for Arendt, this choice, this will, is one of absolute freedom. It has no rational. You don't resolve which I should do, lie or tell the truth by reason or by thinking. You resolve it by some act of love, which cannot be explained or predicted in advance. The great change in our history of willing comes with thinkers like Hegel and the German idealists, who begin to think that there is actually a standard for judging what you should will, namely success, namely history. And so in the final instance, Schelling says, there is no other being than will. All we have is will. It's this act, but we can, in the sense, decide on whether the will was good or not based on whether it accords with progress, with the progress of history. And this idea of willing and progress becomes the driving force of modern thought. The last part of the book and the postscript, the one she never wrote, the one that has caused the most head-wringing by Arendt scholars, is on judgment. And she says, I will conclude the second volume with an analysis of the faculty of judgment. And she says there's a scarcity of sources, and that really no one ever talked about judgment until Kant. We'll leave that aside. But for now, the main point and the interest in judgment here is that it is not logical. We have to take seriously Arendt's claim that judgment, namely how do we judge the past, is not a logical procedure. It's neither deductive, namely we come up with a rule and then we apply that rule to particular cases, nor is it inductive, right? And this is, I think, a mistake some people make. We don't start with the cases and develop a rule. Judgment is not rule-bound. There are no rules for the application of rules. It's one of the most important lines of all of Kant's work. You cannot ever, because even if you come up with a rule saying you should never lie, whether you come up deductively or inductively, from top or from bottom, how do you apply that rule? Was this a lie? Was it not a lie? Was it a good lie, a bad lie? There's no rule for it. And so you can't ever make judgments according to rules. What Kant understood for Arendt is that judgment happens according to something like taste. I like it. It seems good to me. It is good to me. And so what Kant says is, when I see a painting or I hear a bird call, I don't say it feels good to me or it sounds good to me or it looks good to me. I say it is beautiful. It is good. And how do I say that? What rule allows me to say that this painting by Van Gogh is beautiful, but this other one is not? And Kant says there is no rule. It speaks in the voice of God or reason. It makes claims about beauty or goodness, but without any rule. And it has to be based on some authority above the human. Well, how do you do that? That's the problem that Arendt is latching onto here with the problem of judgment. And when she says is, first of all, there's no rule for it, therefore it can't be taught. You can't teach someone to be a good judge. Either somebody knows what a beautiful painting is or they don't. And that's not a very satisfying claim. But let me now back it up a little bit. You can't teach somebody how to be a good judge of a painting or an act or morality, but we all can practice it. And how do you practice it? Well, you make judgments. And you talk to other people, and you look to other people, and you watch their judgments. Arendt says that Kant's great insight here was that we don't judge according to logic, but according to regulative ideals. Regulative ideals are, again, a fancy word, but there are three in Kant. There's God, freedom, and immortality. And the one that I think is easiest for me to explain and the one that's most appropriate here and relevant is freedom. At the end of the second critique, Kant's second critique, he writes, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The oftener and more steadily we reflect on them. So this is reflective judgment. The more we reflect on these two things, the more our minds are filled with ever increasing admiration and awe. One of those things is the starry heavens above, and the other is the moral law within. So what does that mean? It means for Kant that when we reflect on the moral law, not by rules, how do we reflect on it? In his book, The Second Critique, and in also the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, he says that the main way we reflect on morals, on the moral law, is through examples. We see somebody jump onto the train tracks to rescue someone else who's fallen over there, and we know that was a freely done, not required by any law, freely done act that was moral. And we're struck by such an act, by the examples. And we think it must be a moral law to help people in need. And so when we see an example of someone act morally, someone step in front of someone else to take a bullet, or someone, when they don't agree with a war, go to war anyway because it's their moral duty to do so. Someone when they know that lying would be in their best interest but tells the truth. When we see examples of such moral acts, we, just like when we see a Van Gogh painting, we say it's beautiful, we say that's moral. We say that's an example of doing your duty. And we're so struck by it, Arendt says, that we're filled with awe. Now, this word awe, is a word that many of us don't really understand anymore. But awe means something. And if you're in awe of something, what do you do when you're in awe of something? You bow down before it. And so what Arendt says is, when we actually reflect on examples of moral action, we are so filled with awe that we bow down before them, and we do what? We tell ourselves that we have to act that way as well. That's the only way someone can be brought to act. Now, that doesn't mean you will act morally, because I may say I'm going to always tell the truth because I've seen how beautiful that is and how amazing that is, and yet faced with having to tell the truth in an uncomfortable situation, I may still lie. But when I do it, I will know I have broken my moral obligation. And that's what Kant says. That's how the regulative ideals work. And so judgment requires reflecting on the examples of beauty, taste, morality, and practicing making those judgments ourselves, for which there are no rules. And so just to finish up, what she says is there are really then only two alternatives in the modern world for how we make judgments. We can judge with Hegel and Marx and almost all modern moral philosophers who tell us that we should judge according to what is right, according to a standard of either success or a kind of standard of moral education, which is supposed to tell us what is right. And that's what she thinks is the wrong standard of judgment. Or we can judge according to Kantian autonomy, that I set myself under the law and I have to make the judgment myself without any rules, without any standards, without any bearings. And that's what she calls legem theonta, quoting from Herodotus, which is that I must say what is. Brings us back to this relative idea that we talked about in thinking as well. And thus she ends the book with this line that she quotes from Cato: the victorious cause pleased the God. Namely, whatever wins, capitalism wins over socialism, if that's the case, or liberal democracy wins over authoritarian government, if that's the case. Whatever wins, the victorious cause, is the cause that pleased the God, or pleased reason, if you're Hegelian. And thus it's right. But the second part of the quote is, but the defeated cause pleases Cato. And that's where Arendt stands, that we don't judge according to success or reason or divine inspiration. We judge in the end what pleases us. And judgment for her is thus, like thinking, always going to be some sort of a relative claim of my judgment that I know, but it's a claim of not that I think it, but that it's true. But it's one that doesn't have any criteria for it.